June the 18th, 2019, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The war on drugs has engendered new leviathans, invisible, unconquerable prey that are nearly impossible to spot. Today, out in the open seas, a rare catch. In the underwater belly of this beast, the Coast Guard discovers over 7 tons of cocaine, loot worth $230 million. When drug lords fall, criminal organizations reinvent themselves once more.
They never disappear. They simply recompose into networks, not structures. They become nodes in a wider network. And even the command nodes in these networks, you can take down a command node, but it doesn't dismantle the workings of the network itself.
A new era for criminal organizations began at the start of the 90s in a system where everything was accelerating. Transportation, communication, cash flow, globalization. The triumph of free trade hoped to erase borders.
I believe we have made a decision now that will permit us to create an economic order in the world that will promote more growth, more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility of world peace.
In 1994, the United States, along with Canada and Mexico, inaugurated the greatest free trade zone in the world. No more trade barriers and fewer border controls. Mexican factories stepped up the pace, and lines of trucks at the US border grew longer. Hiding drug cargo in the stream of vehicles became the favorite pastime of the Mexican cartels, implanted along the 3,000-kilometer border. Heroin, marijuana, and cocaine flowed practically unobstructed. Helming the country, Mexico's sole political party, the PRI, received its share of the profits.
As long as the traffickers take drugs to the gringos, and as long as they don't challenge the state, it's okay. As long as they don't act against the interests of the PRI to keep power, the state will not interfere with the drug trade very much.
In Colombia, at the head of the cocaine trafficking chain, the political establishment finally let loose on drug traffickers. Under pressure from the DEA, the criminals who came after Pablo Escobar were hunted down. Their shell companies were dismantled and arrests increased. To absorb losses, those who'd survived counted on their Mexican transporters. They asked them to step up the pace.
And they weren't flying one at a time, they were flying convoys. 7 or 14 planes would take off at a time, with each loaded up with nearly 1,000 kilos of cocaine and landing in northern Mexico and Chihuahua. They would be staged there and then smuggled across the border into the US.
The logistics of the Mexican cartels were foolproof. They had the upper hand over the Colombians and imposed a new division of labor. The Mexicans took charge of the riskiest and most lucrative component of the traffic, cocaine distribution in the United States.
The
Mexicans entered a more complicated phase that we experienced as well. The level of corruption in the system sank deeper and deeper, and the violence grew worse. Why? Because the money from distribution came into play, and it was a huge amount of money. And in this business, money is synonymous with violence and death.
Mexico got caught up in a never-ending spiral of violence. Meanwhile, Colombian traffickers stepped back to focus on production, covering entire swaths of their land with coca crops. By the end of the 90s, drug production had become concentrated in lawless areas where it was impossible to unseat. Colombia was the world's leading cocaine producer, and another country emerged as a permanent player in the story of drug trafficking, Afghanistan, the world's top opium producer. Kabul, Afghanistan. Today, 80% of the world's heroin is produced in Afghanistan. The completely illicit drug represents 1/3 of the country's revenue. From the dusty streets of its capital, Kabul, to the highest levels of state, all of Afghanistan has become addicted to heroin. An addiction that was born in the 80s in the midst of the Cold War. The Soviet army occupied the country's big cities, and in the countryside, the Russians strove to repress Afghan resistance.
So in the mid-1980s, they adopted so-called scorched earth policy. They decided to destroy the countryside so people could not live there. And in order to do so, they would burn down orchards, destroy water system, poison wells, but not everyone moved. Instead, people started cultivating opium poppy.
For 10 years, opium poppy funded the tribal leaders' resistance to the Soviet occupation. What was once a marginal crop became the main source of revenue for peasants and warlords. When the Russians left Afghanistan, tribal leaders clashed in a struggle to take power. Several thousand Afghans died in their wars. Throughout the ravaged land, one movement channeled the anger of a people prostrated by years of conflict. The Taliban, born in the Quranic schools, gained ground.
They had political objectives, they didn't like drugs. When they started, they really were very upset with all those corrupted warlords in Afghanistan that they really didn't like, so they wanted to bring law and order. It was not the kind of law and order we liked, but that was their perception. So part of that was to stop opium. Opium was a vice, it's haram, it's not clean.
Everywhere they went, the Taliban imposed their strict laws, closing movie theatres, outlawing music, hiding women from view. Religious law triumphed over everything, but opium was the livelihood of tens of thousands of families. If they banned it, the Taliban risked losing support in the countryside.
To build political capital, the Taliban started saying, well, the Quran says that opium poppy is haram, and it's still haram to use it. But it would say, as long as you produce opium poppy for the kafirs, for the infidels, as long as it goes to Russia or goes to the US, that's perfectly fine with us.
Opium allowed the Taliban to finance their advance on Kabul. The Afghan capital fell in 1996. Afghanistan was immediately ostracized by the international community and cut off from the world.
Afghanistan was a ravaged land, and there was no foreign aid. And so opium was the knife that cut through the Gordian knot of this social puzzle of how to restore economy. It's an annual crop. You put the seed in the ground, and a few months later, you've got a commodity. It's illicit. It magically crosses all boundaries, without any impediment whatsoever.
To fulfill their dream of a fundamentalist state, the Taliban set up labs on their land and turned Afghanistan into the world's leading heroin producer. Drug money made them bold, thinking they could flout international law. In 1998, they granted a safe haven to members of Al-Qaeda. But heroin could not ensure the survival of an entire country. Poverty was rife in Afghanistan. The Taliban regime sorely needed international aid. In hopes of regaining international favour, the Taliban outlawed opium poppy production throughout the country in 2000. Peasants risked death if they planted the forbidden seed. In just 1 year, nearly every poppy field in Afghanistan had disappeared.
And the international community said things like, well, thank you. And the United States, under Secretary of State Colin Powell, actually awarded the regime, I think, $41 million in foreign aid. But there were other issues, human rights, the status of women. And so the UN wasn't going to recognize them. And so the Taliban had, in retrospect, conducted an act of economic suicide.
After the terrorist attacks of September the 11th, 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan.
And it's not surprising that when the first US bombs started falling, that hollow shell of a society and a state collapsed because it was already dead on the inside. It wasn't very strong to begin with, but whatever strength it might have had was gone.
In a matter of weeks, the Taliban were pushed back into isolated zones doomed to disappear. But patiently, little by little, they reconquered the land by encouraging the cultivation of opium poppy, a miraculous source of funds for the rebirth of their movement. Colombian airspace. In Colombia in the mid-90s, coca fields covered whole stretches of land, far from the cities which were now under high surveillance. Drug traffickers sought refuge in the jungles and mountains, well out of the state's reach.
Colombia is a country in spite of itself. Its geography is extremely complex. It's a country that still has many communication problems, and it's had to work incredibly hard to control its land. We've barely finished inhabiting our land, and there are still many unpoliced areas.
In these remote areas, a modern-day Far West, land belonged to whoever had the means to take it. Large landowners purged Colombia's land of its wealth. Gemstones, minerals, oil, rare woods. To extend their operations, these large families created militias that would move populations by force. Colombians called them paramilitaries. With coca crops booming in the countryside, drug traffickers also outfitted themselves with paramilitary groups.
The paramilitaries protected the land for the drug traffickers, who ordered them to clear the land of peasants and settlers and everything. Then the paramilitaries started to accumulate lots of money, and they took the initiative to enter into the drug business themselves.
The paramilitary leaders gradually took control of coca production and the labs, and handled connections with the Mexican cartels and major international crime networks. Deep in the jungle, the scramble for coca would change the fate of another armed group. The FARC, a Marxist guerrilla group, fought for a fair distribution of land. Active on a few fronts, but with meagre means, they would extort large landowners and kidnap them for ransom. But in the mid-90s, FARC guerrillas adapted to the changing times.
There's nothing more conservative than a communist. Communists are very conservative. And at first, they were against drug trafficking because it was going to corrupt the revolution. But there was a lot of pressure from peasants because they needed money.
And so they say it's okay to cultivate coca. And being good revolutionaries and trying to build a social base, so they start delivering a variety of public services flush with the money they get from taxing cultivation.
The FARC used drug money to buy arms and ammunition, but also communication tools that allowed them to synchronize their various fronts and make rapid progress. The FARC continued their abductions, targeting the very heart of the government. Governors, deputies, and former ministers were all held hostage.
The guerrillas camped outside Bogotá. They were here in Medellin, and they were outside Cali. And at the end of the 90s, people were talking about the potential of Colombia becoming a narco state, with the guerrillas taking power.
Faced with the FARC's growing power, paramilitary groups wanted to retain control of coca production zones. In 1997, all the paramilitary factions gathered under one commander. A far-right militia of 20,000 men, the United Self-Defenders of Colombia, defied the guerrillas. Meanwhile, Colombia's legitimate military suffered ambushes by the FARC. Soldiers were abducted in their hundreds.
In that kind of desperate situation, there were elements of the military who said, look, we have to get into bed with this, with the paramilitaries. This is the only way to stop the guerrillas taking power.
So what happens? These mafias end up carrying out a number of massacres throughout Colombia, claiming to be fighting the guerrillas. But actually what they do isn't just drive the guerrillas out of certain areas, but take the land themselves and use it as export corridors for coca.
The paramilitaries eliminated their opponents. The systematic killing led to the displacement of millions of people. The paramilitaries dictated their laws in the zones they took over, areas the state could never reach.
If you're looking for crimes against humanity in Colombia, this is where you'll find them, with the paramilitaries. They were the main violators of human rights and committed the most massacres and barbaric acts.
Now, the political class in Colombia, as we've seen, has nothing honest about it and is extremely corrupt. And at a certain point, it saw the paramilitaries as a great opportunity to obtain votes and political representation. It's quite practical to receive the votes and armed support of the paramilitaries. But it's less practical when you become governor and they ask for a spot in the housing or health administration, where the largest public contracts are, or if you're a senator and a paramilitary phones to tell you to resign for a year because one of his men is going to take your seat.
In the early 2000s, the paramilitaries were in the same position as Pablo Escobar 20 years earlier.
Inicia su intervención el señor Salvatore Mancuso.
Before the Congress, one of their leaders, Salvatore Mancuso, defended the role of his men. A few years later, Salvatore Mancuso, nicknamed 000, would admit to the murder of 300 people.
Reafirmo aquí, en la cuna de las leyes y en el templo de la democracia, que el compromiso patriótico de la SAUC por salvaguardar una Colombia libre, digna, segura y en paz sigue en pie.
Salvatore Mancuso spoke to an appreciative audience. Paramilitaries controlled a third of parliament. Colombia had failed to push traffickers out. The paramilitaries had turned it into a narco state. Unlike Colombian traffickers, the cartels in Mexico never tried to take the reins of the government. Traffickers accepted the game of corruption orchestrated by the single party, the PRI, in power for 70 years. In 2000, Mexicans shrugged off the authoritarian reign of the PRI by electing Vicente Fox as president. It was the promise of a new era for Mexico, and the change in power reshuffled the cards for traffickers.
It did break what I would call the Pax Mafiosa, and that is to say essentially the understanding between the Mexican state and the major narcotic trafficking organizations that they were untouchable. They weren't going to be touched. So it did break that certainty that you had had for years under the PRI.
The PRI acted as a mediator between the cartels. Once they were gone, violence was the only way to weed out competitors. Overlapping wars soon broke out among all the cartels.
At that time, the local and regional political class no longer had the means to contain the drug lords' power. And so in Mexico, we could say that the drug war is the price of democratization.
In this cartel war, the historic bastion of trafficking, the Sinaloa, was on every front. Driven by the insatiable appetite of its leader, El Chapo, freshly escaped from a high-security prison.
El Chapo Guzman is one of the most successful drug traffickers ever in history.
And his nickname before Chapo was El Rápido, the quick one, because he was able to move drugs into the US at a very, very high speed.
He became an emblematic figure, practically a mythical figure of Mexican drug culture.
Chapo was also very diligent and very systematic in how to manage brutality and extortion against rivals.
Clever and ruthless, El Chapo would have to strike even harder if he wanted to stay in the game. On the other side of the country, the Gulf Cartel recruited elite soldiers from the Mexican army and created an armed wing, Los Zetas. Military discipline, planned operations, intelligence methods were redirected with a single goal: terrorize the competition and take over their territory. Los Zetas triggered one-upmanship among the other cartels. Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and Sinaloa all outfitted themselves with elite units. Scenes of horror erupted.
My God, they were in Michoacan. I mean, the organized crime group there, they were cutting off heads of rival cartels and literally tossing them on the dance floor. I mean, it was out of hand.
In 2006, the newly elected president, Felipe Calderón, declared war on the cartels and sent the army to the front. 45,000 soldiers tried to win back the lost territories, focusing their efforts on Los Zetas, the most bloodthirsty of the cartels. Under the army's blows, Los Zetas imploded into a multitude of groups. They tightened their grip on smaller territories, and the violence ratcheted up a notch. Los Zetas filmed their murders and tortures in detail, leaving a Z on the walls and bodies of their victims.
What happened with Los Zetas is that they didn't have enough money to remain in constant conflict with the state. So they turned violence into a commodity. Los Zetas didn't sell the logistics to move cocaine. Los Zetas sold the ability to use violence in a professional manner in order to impose a local state of terror.
They didn't just stay involved in drug trafficking. You had to pay what's called the piso for everything. So if you were running human smuggling through their territory, if you were engaged in kidnapping in their territory, extortion, they got involved in all. You had to pay the Zetas.
The army, unable to fight on every front, left the Sinaloa cartel to prosper. By the end of the bloody wars, El Chapo had expanded his zone of influence to Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez.
The use of the army to try to reduce violence was counterproductive. Not only did the violence continue in the atrocious forms we'd seen, but it gradually increased quantitatively until it hit dramatic levels.
At the start of the 2000s, the US and Colombia also chose the military option. They elaborated the most extensive plan for battling drug trafficking, Plan Colombia, $4 billion over 5 years. Hundreds of American advisors revamped the Colombian army. Bolstered by these new means, Colombia turned away from its initial goal. The main traffickers, paramilitaries, allies of the state were not targeted. The plan against drugs became a war plan. Bogotá poured everything it had into fighting its main enemy, the FARC guerrillas, active in nearly half of the country.
The situation shifted in the state's favor for the first time, and Colombia's army began to regain control of territory for the first time in many years.
To put it plainly, it was the most effective plan of American military aid in the past 20 to 25 years. Plan Colombia restored the country's security and brought kidnappings down from 3,000 to 200.
So in that way, I think it was very important. But there was a high price to pay for a war waged in those conditions. It was an irregular war, with bombings we never even heard about here in Bogotá.
The dirty war, waged far from the cameras, dealt a severe blow to the FARC. Its historic leaders were eliminated. In time, a process of negotiation would begin with the guerrillas. For Colombia, the military offensive was just the first step. The next stage was initiated under pressure from Washington. Despite Plan Colombia, tons of cocaine was still flowing into the US. The Colombian government was ordered to take action against the paramilitaries. In 2006, the hard right in power practically offered them an amnesty, leaving over 100,000 killers unpunished. Paramilitary fighters turned in their weapons to carnival music.
The agreement was made in a way that the perpetrators didn't need to compensate their victims for their land or property, nor by telling the truth. And that's something that hurt me deeply. For all the massacres they committed, including the one that concerns me, in which my sister was killed, for all those years the paramilitaries enjoyed infinite impunity.
The biggest jolt came from the Supreme Court. The judges decided to open an investigation into the incestuous relationships between paramilitaries and political leaders. A large-scale cleanup began. The court examined, flushed out, and convicted several politicians.
What changed the life of Colombians was the unrelenting effort Colombia made to strengthen its public force, its security, and rule of law. That's what has transformed and changed Colombia.
These efforts towards justice and memory continue today in a Colombia that seems to be catching its breath. Violence is diminishing in the big cities, and Colombia is becoming a tourist destination. Yet, well out of sight in hard-to-reach areas, the same actions are carried on endlessly.
Here, we harvest the coca and take it to the lab every 3 months. Every 3 months, we harvest it and take it to the lab where it's transformed into paste. And the buyers come to our home.
Like thousands of coca growers, this farmer has endured eradication campaigns led by authorities with the help of the DEA. For 30 years, Agent Orange, Monsanto's glyphosate and thousands of liters of herbicides were sprayed on coca plants and ravaged entire regions.
In 1994, I was in Caqueta. It was a great place to grow coca. With the harvests, you could earn a little money. But when they started spraying, everything was ruined. People got sick and wound up nearly blind. And cattle, trees, everything, it destroyed the earth. When they sprayed, you couldn't plant anything anymore because the soil was no good. And when they sprayed and it was all over, I came here to Nariño and I pulled out all the coffee plants to grow coca.
On his 3 hectares, this grower produces roughly 70 kilos of coca paste, which earns him 10 times more than if he grew coffee.
The transformed paste goes to the other side. They send it to Mexico, the US, to other countries, because that's where it's worth money. Because 1 kilo here is worth almost nothing, whereas over there, it is.
To make 1 kilo of cocaine, it takes 350 kilos of coca leaves, $400. Once it is transformed, crosses borders, is sold bulk then retail, and cut. All this means that same kilo of cocaine sells for over $120,000 on the streets of New York, 300 times its base price. When part of the harvest in Colombia is eradicated, the price of the coca leaf could triple. Out on the streets, this makes the cost of 1 gram rise from $122 to $122.77. Not enough to discourage the New York user or to slow down the traffic. In Colombia, coca still finances dozens of armed groups. They are the distant successors of the great cartels, direct descendants of the paramilitary factions, or FARCs who refused the historic peace deal in 2016.
After 30 or 40 years of waging the war on drugs in Colombia, we're producing more cocaine than ever. But nevertheless, we consider this a success because criminal organizations are governing less.
We've made progress for sure, but we're still in a complicated and difficult situation, with the fear that these amounts of coca crops could reactivate things we're unable to control. And yes, I'm scared that fuse will get lit again.
As long as drug crops grow, criminal or insurgent movements can take possession of them. In Afghanistan, the US underestimated this latent danger. After driving the Taliban out of power in 2001, Washington thought the problem was solved. A few years later, the US Army was facing a powerful insurrection. The Taliban had used drug money to enlist thousands of fighters. In 2004, under pressure from Washington, President Hamid Karzai declared a jihad against opium. But But the Afghan president would play against his side. His authority was held only by the fragile coalition of warlords and former mujahideen who used drug money themselves to run their fiefdoms.
Of course, there are many people in the Afghan government who were involved in the drug trade, same as in the other the opposing forces. This is not a secret. Everybody knew it. It was not very convenient in those days to talk about it because there are political allies. Yeah? That was the logic.
In 2005, in the region of Helmand, over 9 tons of opium were discovered in the governor's basement. President Hamid Karzai had to remove him. Without his revenue, the governor's militia changed sides. His 3,000 men joined the Taliban and upset the balance of power. The region of Helmand fell into the hands of the Taliban, who turned it into the country's leading zone of heroin production. To cut off the Taliban's main source of revenue, the US beefed up its military response.
US B-52 bombers and US F-22 Raptor fighters bomb Taliban heroin labs. So here's an F-22 fighter costs about $400 million. And a heroin lab, which sounds fancy, but really is a mud brick shed with some rusting tin drums and a cheap electric heater. Probably $50 worth of equipment, where the U.S. uses its most sophisticated military equipment and all of its targeting and intelligence and research, the drones to monitor movement, the satellite imagery, the B-52 bomber, which is the biggest military airplane on the planet, to attack these tin roof sheds with their steel drums is I think a demonstration of the limits of coercion.
There is not one case where eradication has bankrupted belligerents or significantly weakened them to make them easier to defeat. People go hungry. They literally don't have anything to eat. And they will protest and they will mobilize. And so what happens is that the criminal groups, insurgent groups, like in Afghanistan or in Colombia, get a lot of political capital. People switch allegiance to them. And in fact, the history of the so-called narco-militancy nexus, narco-insurgency nexus, is that the state wins against insurgents when it stops eradicating.
After 50 years of war, Kabul, Afghanistan's capital, is now home to the world's highest concentration of drug addicts. In the countryside, practically 1 out of every 2 families is affected by heroin addiction. The country continues to founder. In Mexico, a century after trafficking first began, popular culture celebrates narcos and their swift rise in society. The small farmers who planted poppies in the last century in the mountains of Sinaloa gave birth to traffickers able to exploit every crack in the system. Absolute symbol of the revenge of the weak, El Chapo Guzman, leader of the Sinaloa cartel, dodged authorities for 15 years and amassed a fortune of $1 billion, which police are still looking for.
The drug trafficking organizations can afford the best lawyers. They can afford the best investment brokers. They can afford the best accountants. And the security forces and law enforcement are hugely outgunned in terms of accountants and lawyers.
Hundreds of millions of dollars belonging to the Sinaloa cartel were found laundered in the accounts of the world's biggest banking institutions. The banks all obtained a legal settlement. No convictions were pronounced.
But rather than say that this financial system is deeply unstable and fueled by dirty money, we continue not to penalize it and say that, for lack of anything better, we're moving forward this way, and we close our eyes a little. So for them, it's always worth it to continue this trafficking. It remains profitable, and that shows on the level of big banks with legal departments that provision more and more money from one year to the next. In other words, in the prospect of a trial, they've evaluated and set a price on fraud, on skirting the rules, and on lack of banking responsibility.
In 2015, El Chapo was caught when he contacted an actress he'd grown infatuated with. One of the world's greatest drug kingpins was brought down by an amateur mistake. Extradited to the United States and sentenced to life in prison, El Chapo left in his wake a nebula of drug trafficking and the myth of a hierarchical cartel held by a single man.
The current criminal world is no longer in the hands of those whose names we hear in the media.
Quizá lo más claro
And perhaps what remains of the Sinaloa cartel for Mexico is above all nostalgia. The nostalgia of a criminal organization that used violence in a predictable manner.
Today in Mexico, violence has crept in everywhere all the time. Yesterday's big cartels have been split up by the army, which is still deployed throughout the country. A myriad of small elusive groups appear, decline, disappear, and reform constantly. On the Pacific coast, Acapulco, Mexico's crown jewel, has become one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Around 30 crime organizations are active in the region.
Small groups in Mexico are a major problem. And the fact that there are small and very many, and that they operate in the context of law enforcement that is seen as weak and incompetent, means that there is tremendous violence.
I'm the person who picks up the bodies from the hospitals, from the coroners, from homes. I'm the one who offers support to people, who helps support them in their pain. I've already had to go to collect corpses from graves where there were 8 or 9 bodies. When there are disembodied bodies, we have to inject them piece by piece, sew the bodies together so they're in one piece, so families can see their relatives. And then we give the families an explanation. Often, in many cases, the bodies can't be given a wake because of their state of decomposition. We prepare them, then we close the casket, because you can't see a body in a state like that.
In Mexico, death has every right. The bodies are stacked one on top of the other, and there's no power that can repair the damage that is done each day. Every day we wake up to the news of another hidden grave. We wake up to learn a new organized crime group has emerged.
Over the past 10 years, more than 40,000 people have disappeared in Mexico, killed by criminal organizations that blindly strike, extort or kidnap for ransom people who oftentimes are innocent.
I'm searching for my brother Tomas, my big brother, who was kidnapped on July 5th, 2012 from Huitzico, Guerrero.
Mario Vergara combs the land relentlessly, searching for his brother's body. With other grieving families, he has dug up over 400 bodies over the last 5 years. Here, just an hour's drive from Acapulco.
In this place, which is called the Lake of Iguala Guerrero, we found 21 bodies, all bearing signs of torture. Hands and feet bound, blindfolded.
They recruit your children to turn them into killers. If you're a farmer, they force you to give up your corn crops to plant opium poppy instead. They can make your husband go missing, and you might spend your whole life looking for him because they've recruited him for criminal work. Or you could find him dead in one of the secret graves.
The mountains are very beautiful, and the landscape is stunning, it's true. But it hides the horror that man has committed within it.
Aquí está el cráneo.
Here's the skull.
Este es el cráneo de una persona.
This is someone's skull.
Tiene el tiro de gracia acá.
You can see where the bullet went in here.
A lo que he aprendido, lo trajeron.
According to what I was told, this man was brought here, they shot him, and he fell face first. We're digging up the truth of this country. We're telling the government, yes, people have disappeared in Mexico. Yes, there are secret graves in Mexico, and you're not doing your job. We're doing it for you.
The only good thing in all of this is that the Mexican people are getting more and more organized each day. There are lots of women's organizations that are standing up to a state that lacks the capacity to provide justice and to find their loved ones.
Each mass grave must be visited by the authorities, who are storing over 27,000 unidentified bodies as of today. A new chapter in the story of drug trafficking is opening somewhere in China. A return full circle. Criminal organizations have stolen yet another secret from the pharmaceutical industry. By manipulating chemicals, they've managed to synthesize fentanyl, a distant cousin of opium. Manufactured since the 1950s for medical use, fentanyl is made without the slightest trace of poppy flower. The drug is 100% synthetic. Today, these ports, where the first bundles of opium arrived in the 19th century, mark the point of departure for invisible cargoes of an infinitely powerful drug.
Fentanyl is at least 100 times more potent than heroin. So it might take several trucks, trailer trucks of cocaine to supply the US drug market for a year. Well, it might take just one carload to supply, a small carload to supply the US entire opioid market with fentanyl.
You can basically forget about the agriculture. I mean, you don't need peasants growing opium poppies in Afghanistan or in Mexico or Colombia. You don't need armies and warlords who are shipping opium. If you simply have chemicals that you can manufacture in China and then ship to Mexico and then use them to produce drugs like fentanyl, it greatly simplifies the process, and it means that you can base your operations anywhere.
So modern synthetic drugs really have the potential to radically change the illegal drug trade and the politics, international relations, and geopolitics to surround it.
Fentanyl flows into a country grappling with the greatest addiction epidemic in its history. In the United States, the overprescription of painkillers encouraged by pharmaceutical lobbies has caused hundreds of thousands of patients to become addicted to opiates. When their treatment stops and the illusion of well-being is shattered, they turn to illicit markets. Every day, middle-class men and women join the horde of heroin addicts and fall victim to fentanyl, which is less expensive and a lot more powerful. Fentanyl kills 30,000 people each year in the US. This vial is a death trap for those who seek refuge from the pain of living. Yet there's nothing fatal about that. As long as the war targets drug trafficking rather than the causes of drug use, we will live in a constantly shifting mafia environment. The world of drugs was created by our societal choices and our economic system. The only solution is to change it.